On a cold February evening in 2003, the small town of Bayfield, Michigan, settled into its quiet rhythm. Snow had been falling since late afternoon, leaving the streets covered in a soft layer that reflected the yellow light from the few working street lamps. Houses along Cedar Lane were dim, curtains drawn against the winter chill, and only the sound of the wind moved steadily through the neighborhood. Most residents ended the day as they always did, with simple routines of dinner, television, and early rest. It was the kind of night that promised no surprises, yet it would be remembered for decades. Inside a modest single-story home near the edge of town, 27-year-old nurse Erin Callahan returned from a long shift at the local hospital. She parked her car in the driveway, footprints marking her path from the garage to her back door. The routine was ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of detail neighbors had witnessed many times before. What happened next was not witnessed at all, and it would trouble investigators for years. The following morning, a coworker grew concerned when Erin failed to appear for her shift. She was known for punctuality, rarely late, never absent without calling. After unanswered phone calls, her sister stopped by the house around noon. What she found prompted an immediate call to police. Officers arrived within minutes, entering through the front door with the sister's permission. Inside, the house appeared calm at first glance. The living room was tidy. A grocery bag on the counter contained bread and milk, and the bedroom light was off. Yet in Erin's bedroom, officers discovered her lying on the floor beside the bed. She showed clear signs of having been attacked, and it was evident she had been dead for several hours. Detectives quickly documented the scene. What puzzled them most was the condition of the doors. The front door was locked, as expected. The back door, however, stood open several inches. Snow had drifted inside, collecting in a small pile against the kitchen floor. Beyond the threshold, the backyard was blanketed in fresh snow, but there were no visible footprints leading away from the house. The paradox was immediate. Someone had entered and left, yet the ground outside offered no trace. Inside the bedroom, investigators searched carefully. The dresser showed no signs of forced entry. Jewelry boxes remained intact, and cash was untouched. One item, however, drew attention. Erin was rarely seen without a silver necklace, a gift from her mother. That necklace was missing, and a faint mark on her skin suggested she had been wearing it earlier that evening. The absence of such a personal item complicated the interpretation of motive. Neighbors were interviewed that afternoon. None reported hearing unusual noises during the night. One elderly neighbor recalled seeing Erin carry groceries from her car around 8:30 p.m., but after that, the street had been silent. Another neighbor had gone to bed early and awoke only when police cars arrived the next day. No one saw strangers, and no unfamiliar vehicles were reported. By evening, word spread quickly through Bayfield. Erin's death shocked the small town, where violent crime was rare and often limited to domestic disputes. A sudden, unexplained killing challenged the sense of safety people had taken for granted. Officers reassured residents that the investigation was active, but behind the scenes, they struggled with the conflicting details. The paradox of the back door weighed heavily on detectives. Had the killer brushed away footprints, or had snowfall erased them before morning? Was the door opened after the fact to stage confusion, or had the attacker left in a rush? These questions had no immediate answer. Investigators noted them carefully, knowing they might matter years later. On that first night, nothing felt resolved. Evidence was collected, photographs taken, and Erin's body transported to Lansing for autopsy. By midnight, Cedar Lane returned to silence, but for the residents who lived there, the street would never feel the same again. The contradictions would linger in the town's memory for years to come. To understand the case, you must first understand Erin. She had grown up in Bayfield, attending the local high school before training as a nurse in Lansing. By her mid-20s, she returned to her hometown, drawn back by family ties and the steady comfort of community life. Her colleagues at St. Mary's Hospital described her as reliable, compassionate, and tireless during long shifts. She worked nights more often than not, often joking that she had grown used to living under fluorescent lights. Erin lived in a small but comfortable house she had purchased the year before her death. The neighborhood was quiet, with families who knew one another well. Children played in the summers along the sidewalks, and winter meant neighbors helping shovel each other's driveways. Erin was remembered for waving to everyone, sometimes stopping at the local diner for coffee before her night shifts. She carried herself with quiet energy, blending into the town's rhythm while still being someone people noticed. Her death altered that rhythm instantly. In a place where crimes rarely went beyond small disputes, the sudden loss of a young woman with no known enemies unsettled everyone. Parents grew more cautious, and single women double-checked locks in the weeks after. The local paper carried her photo on the front page, the headline simple, "Nurse found dead in home." For many, the shock was less about the details of the crime and more about the fact that it happened at all. Family members spoke of Erin's generosity. She had cared for her mother during a long illness, often driving her to appointments even after 12-hour shifts. Friends recalled her steady laugh, her tendency to bring baked goods to work on holidays, her habit of calling her sister every evening. These small consistencies made her absence sharper. The idea that she had been attacked inside her own home felt not only tragic, but deeply personal to everyone who had known her. One image in particular lingered in memory. On the day of her death, several people saw her walking home from the hospital with her winter coat buttoned to her chin, carrying a grocery bag in one hand. The picture of that simple routine, walking along snow-dusted sidewalks, steps measured, head slightly bent against the wind, became the last living memory neighbors carried of her. That she vanished from such ordinary circumstances left the town deeply unsettled. As police investigated, townspeople spoke quietly among themselves. At the diner, theories were exchanged in low voices. Some thought it must have been a stranger passing through. Others believed it was someone Erin knew, someone she trusted enough to let inside. Each idea reflected the unease of a community no longer sure of its boundaries. The funeral drew nearly the entire town. The church filled beyond capacity, and the parking lot overflowed with vehicles from surrounding counties. At the service, co-workers placed flowers on her casket, and her sister spoke of Erin's steadiness, the way she held family together through ordinary kindness. That memory became a counterweight to the darker story unfolding in police files. Her absence left a silence that grew louder with every passing day. The hours before Erin's death were reconstructed with care. Investigators relied on receipts, phone records, and witness interviews to piece together her final day. On February 14, 2003, she began her shift at St. Mary's Hospital at 10 a.m. and worked until 6:45 p.m. Staff recalled her leaving with her usual calm, carrying her bag, and saying goodnight without any sign of distress. At 7:10 p.m., a grocery receipt confirmed a purchase at the town market. Items included bread, milk, and fruit, nothing unusual. Security footage showed her at the register, coat collar up against the cold, hair slightly damp from snow. By 8:10 p.m., her sister received a phone call. Records show the call lasted 6 minutes. Erin spoke about work and mentioned being tired, but nothing suggested fear. Neighbors reported seeing her carry groceries inside shortly afterward. The lights in her house were observed on by 9 p.m. By 10, curtains were drawn, and the street outside was quiet. Investigators estimated that Erin settled into her evening routine much as she always did. The timeline between 10:30 p.m. and midnight was the most significant. The medical examiner later determined her time of death fell within that window, based on body temperature and other post-mortem indicators. What remained unclear was how someone entered the house without obvious signs of force. The front door was locked when police arrived the next day, suggesting the killer either had a key or exited elsewhere. Attention turned to the back door, found ajar when officers arrived. The kitchen floor bore signs of snow drift, confirming it had been open for hours. Outside, however, the blanket of snow showed no footprints. Weather reports from that night indicated steady snowfall until around 3 a.m. Investigators concluded that any footprints left around midnight may have been covered by morning, erasing physical traces of the escape. Inside the house, evidence was sparse. There were no overturned chairs, no broken windows, and no signs of prolonged struggle. Erin's body position suggested she had been surprised or overpowered quickly. Her clothing was undisturbed beyond the immediate struggle. The missing silver necklace, however, remained notable. Family members confirmed she never removed it except for medical shifts. Its absence hinted at a deliberate removal, perhaps taken as a memento or discarded somewhere unknown. Detectives carefully documented these details, aware that small inconsistencies often proved decisive in later years. They noted that Erin's alarm clock was set for 6:30 a.m., consistent with her routine. A mug of tea sat half-finished on the bedside table. These quiet domestic details emphasized how ordinary the night had been before violence interrupted. The paradox of entry lingered. Did Erin open the door for someone she knew? Did the killer arrive before snowfall thickened, leaving prints later erased by weather? Each possibility carried implications for identifying suspects. At that early stage, however, the case remained a puzzle without enough pieces. As the timeline settled into place, one fact grew clear. Erin's death occurred in the narrow hours between her last phone call and the quiet of midnight. Beyond that, investigators could only speculate, but timelines without answers soon turned into theories. Investigators launched a full-scale inquiry in the days following Erin's death. Bayfield police, with support from the Michigan State Police, set up a command post at the edge of town. Detectives began with the most immediate circle: neighbors, family, and co-workers. Every interview was logged, every observation typed and filed. The case was treated with urgency, not only for the sake of justice, but also because the community was unsettled by the sudden act of violence. Attention first turned to Erin's recent boyfriend, a man named Mark Willis. He had been seen with her in town several times, and their relationship had ended 2 months earlier. Interviews revealed that while the breakup was amicable on the surface, disagreements about future plans lingered. Detectives questioned him extensively. He admitted to seeing Erin days before her death, but denied visiting on the night in question. His alibi was partially supported by co-workers who confirmed his presence at a late-night shift at the factory where he worked. The account did not fully remove suspicion, but no physical evidence connected him to the scene. Another person of interest emerged from Erin's workplace. A co-worker, recently disciplined for repeated tardiness, had argued with her over shift coverage in the week leading up to her death. Colleagues described tension between them, though none reported threats or violence. He was questioned, and his statements placed him at home during the critical hours. Phone records supported his version, showing multiple calls made around midnight. Still, detectives kept his name on file as they continued their review. A third individual drew attention, a neighbor who occasionally helped Erin with small chores, including shoveling snow and carrying groceries. Some residents mentioned seeing him linger near her house in the past. When questioned, he explained that he admired her kindness but denied any involvement. His alibi was thin, claiming he was asleep at home with no witnesses. Officers collected a statement but lacked evidence to proceed further. The physical investigation focused on the home itself. Fingerprints were lifted from several surfaces, including the kitchen door and bedroom dresser. Most belonged to Erin or family members who had visited. A few partial prints were too smudged to identify. Blood samples and fibers were taken, though technology at the time limited analysis. The most promising item was a strand of hair discovered near Erin's hand. It was collected, sealed, and logged, but in 2003, the available testing could only provide limited information. It revealed that the hair was not Erin's, yet no suspect matched the limited profile. Detectives also canvassed the surrounding area. Gas stations, stores, and highways leading out of town were reviewed for unusual activity. No vehicles stood out, and no witnesses recalled strangers. A statewide bulletin was issued, but nothing concrete returned. Each lead seemed to open briefly, only to close again. The autopsy report offered little clarity. Cause of death was determined as strangulation, with no additional injuries that might suggest prolonged struggle. Toxicology screens came back negative, confirming Erin had not been drugged. The lack of defensive wounds suggested she had been surprised and subdued quickly. Investigators debated whether this indicated familiarity with the attacker, but no clear answer emerged. Months passed with steady but fruitless effort. By late summer, the case slowed. Detectives had followed dozens of leads, yet none tied directly to Erin's final night. The town, once restless with fear, gradually settled into uneasy acceptance. Without an arrest, the case became another entry in state files. For Erin's family, the lack of resolution deepened the loss. They pushed for updates, attended meetings, and urged persistence, but over time, they heard fewer new details. The case that had once consumed attention slowly receded into silence, joining the long list of unsolved crimes that waited for answers. And yet, after months of effort, the trail went cold. As the years passed, Erin's case faded from headlines, but never from memory. By 2008, 5 years after her death, the town of Bayfield had grown quieter about the details. Yet her family continued to mark anniversaries, gathering at her grave each February. Her sister often left handwritten notes, folded beneath small stones to keep them from blowing away in the winter wind. These gestures kept the story alive within her circle, even as public discussion waned. Local newspapers revisited the case occasionally. On the 10-year anniversary in 2013, a brief article summarized the facts: a nurse found in her home, the missing necklace, the unanswered questions. Readers responded with subdued comments, expressing sorrow but offering little new information. For many, the case was painful to recall, and silence became the easier path. In 2011, the lead detective retired. Boxes of evidence were cataloged and transferred to a secure storage facility in Lansing, stacked alongside countless other unresolved cases. Files were updated with the hope that advances in technology might someday allow for renewed analysis. Still, for the families, these transfers often felt like endings rather than steps toward progress. Bayfield itself changed gradually during these years. Businesses opened and closed. Families moved in and out. Yet Erin's name remained quietly present. Teachers occasionally mentioned her to students, reminding them of the importance of safety. Hospital staff continued to recall her work ethic when training new nurses. Even without new developments, she was remembered not only for the way she died, but also for the way she lived. The absence of clear progress left the community with questions that became part of its identity. Conversations at the diner turned toward other topics, but the case lingered in the background, like a shadow that had never fully lifted. People locked doors more diligently. Some wondered aloud if the killer had left town or if he still lived quietly among them. Without answers, speculation filled the silence. For the Callahan family, each year brought renewed grief. Holidays passed without Erin's presence, and milestones, birthdays, weddings, new children, were marked by her absence. Her mother, who had struggled with illness, passed away in 2014, never knowing who was responsible. Her sister carried the weight forward, determined to keep the memory alive even as others moved on. By 2015, 12 years after the murder, only a few new tips reached police. Most were vague or unsubstantiated. Investigators, faced with limited resources, could not pursue every suggestion. The reality of cold cases set in. Without new evidence, progress remained stalled. And so, while time changed the town and its people, the unanswered questions stayed the same. The evidence boxes sat untouched, and the necklace remained missing. To many, the silence felt heavier than the noise of investigation, because it meant nothing new was being learned. Until science caught up with what the town had long wondered. 17 years later, the evidence was not forgotten. In 2020, the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit initiated a statewide project to re-examine unsolved crimes using updated forensic tools. Among the files selected was the case of Erin Callahan. Detectives retrieved the sealed evidence boxes from storage and transported them to the state laboratory in Lansing. Inside those boxes lay the hair strand collected from her bedroom in 2003. At the time, only partial analysis had been possible, producing limited results. Now, with advanced mitochondrial sequencing, scientists could create a more complete profile. Careful steps ensured chain of custody. Seals were checked, logs reviewed, and signatures verified before testing began. The process was meticulous. Technicians worked in controlled environments to prevent contamination. Over several weeks, fragments of genetic information were pieced together, eventually forming a profile that had not been possible 2 decades earlier. When the final results came back, the lab confirmed a breakthrough. The hair belonged to a male individual, not previously identified in state or federal databases. This result transformed the case from stagnant to active. Detectives contacted Erin's surviving family to explain the development. For them, hope resurfaced after years of silence. The possibility that answers might finally emerge brought both relief and renewed pain. Each step forward reopened memories of the night she was lost. Investigators then explored the next stage, genealogical comparison. While the profile did not match anyone in criminal databases, it could be compared against public genealogy records. Specialized teams began the labor-intensive process of building family trees from distant relatives, linking patterns of DNA inheritance across generations. Weeks of work produced promising leads. Distant relatives with shared markers appeared in multiple branches of the database. Analysts carefully mapped these connections, narrowing possibilities to family lines concentrated in Michigan. The work was less about sudden revelations and more about gradual elimination, each new record trimming the field of possibilities. Forensic genealogy was a discipline requiring patience, and investigators knew errors could mislead. Every link had to be supported by verifiable documents, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and census records. As trees grew, detectives looked for connections to Bayfield in 2003. By autumn of 2020, focus settled on a particular lineage stretching toward Flint. Several individuals fit the geographic and age profiles. Among them was a man who once lived only 2 blocks from Erin at the time of her death. His name was Daniel Haskins. The discovery was significant, but not yet conclusive. Detectives kept the information within a small circle, proceeding carefully. Surveillance was arranged, with officers discreetly collecting discarded items from Haskins to compare against the profile. Results would take time, but the groundwork was in place. What emerged from the lab would change everything. Detectives re-examining the evidence in 2021 entered their work with a structured approach. The DNA hit had identified a living individual, but building a complete case meant placing that person within Amy's world in 2003. They began with records, vehicle registrations, addresses, and employment logs. Each line of data painted a picture of someone who had moved quietly through the county, yet intersected with Amy's path in ways that mattered. The suspect, a man named David Rourke, lived less than 2 miles from her apartment at the time. He had no known relationship with her, yet his routine often overlapped with hers at nearby stores and public spaces. Detectives mapped his movements, using archived employment schedules from the auto parts warehouse where he worked. On the evening Amy disappeared, his time card showed he had clocked out early, around 7:30. That detail aligned with the gas station footage showing Amy later that evening. Investigators noted the proximity. They also checked utility bills, finding that Rourke's apartment electricity spiked unusually the same night, suggesting late activity. While not conclusive, the timing raised their interest. Background checks revealed a minor criminal history. In 1998, Rourke had been questioned in connection with a break-in at a residence 2 towns over. No charges were filed, but the report described his pattern of entering through unlocked doors. That detail stood out, given that Amy's apartment door had shown no forced entry. Detectives highlighted the similarity and filed it alongside the DNA evidence. Investigators also revisited neighborhood interviews from 2003. One resident had described a dark sedan idling near Amy's building. Cross-referencing records showed that Rourke owned a dark blue Chevrolet of the same year and make at the time. Though the description was broad, the alignment was another strand of the lattice forming around him. Slowly, the collection of details moved beyond coincidence. Detectives tracked down former co-workers. Some remembered Rourke as quiet and withdrawn. One recalled he often lingered in the parking lot after shifts, smoking and watching others leave. Another remembered he mentioned living near the university area, a neighborhood close to Amy's route home. These recollections, though anecdotal, matched the developing profile. Investigators wrote careful notes, keeping the narrative clear and factual. Financial records added another dimension. In the week following Amy's disappearance, Rourke deposited cash inconsistent with his known income. The amounts were modest, but raised questions about their source. Detectives noted that robbery had not been suspected, yet the missing purse had never been found. Though Amy's wallet and ID were left behind, the absence of her bag connected subtly with this anomaly. By late 2021, the case against Rourke rested on converging lines. DNA from the apartment, a time card that placed him free during the critical window, a vehicle matching witness description, a past pattern of entering unlocked residences, and financial inconsistency. Each piece, alone, carried limits. Together, they formed a lattice strong enough to justify a warrant. Detectives presented the findings to the county prosecutor, who approved the next phase, surveillance and eventual arrest. The town, unaware of these developments, continued its quiet routines. Few remembered the case beyond a fading photo in the precinct hallway. Yet within the investigation office, momentum was building. For the first time in decades, detectives believed they were standing at the threshold of an answer. The arrest took place in February 2022. Detectives approached Rourke's modest home in the early morning, serving the warrant with precision. He appeared surprised but did not resist. Inside, officers found a neatly kept residence, with boxes of personal papers stacked in the basement. Among them was a faded purse, later confirmed through serial numbers on the lining to be Amy Kesler's. That discovery, combined with the DNA, sealed the case. Interrogation transcripts show that Rourke initially denied knowing Amy. He claimed he had never met her and had no reason to visit her apartment. Confronted with the DNA results, he fell silent for long stretches, offering vague denials. When detectives presented the recovered purse, he shifted, stating he had found it discarded years ago. The explanation carried no credibility. Prosecutors prepared charges of murder, bolstered by forensic confirmation and corroborating evidence. The community reacted with a mixture of shock and relief. Local media revisited the story, now able to report a breakthrough. Reporters interviewed Amy's parents, who expressed sorrow but also gratitude that answers had finally come. Their words were calm, closure, not triumph. Vigils resumed, this time framed as remembrance rather than search. Court proceedings extended through the year. Prosecutors laid out the evidence, the DNA match, the purse in his home, and the timeline constructed from employment records and neighborhood accounts. Defense attorneys attempted to argue contamination and coincidence, but the chain of custody proved airtight. Jurors listened carefully, noting the consistency of the evidence. Testimony from forensic analysts carried weight. They explained how the DNA recovered from a single hair strand in Amy's apartment aligned with Rourke's profile at a probability exceeding 1 in a trillion. They described the process calmly, allowing jurors to follow without confusion. Detectives testified about the investigation's decades-long timeline, emphasizing the persistence of record-keeping that made the revival possible. When the verdict arrived, it was guilty on all major counts. The sentence, life without parole, was delivered with quiet finality. Reporters described the courtroom as solemn, not dramatic. Even in justice, the tone matched the case itself, steady, restrained, and respectful of the family's decades-long wait. For the town, the case closed a lingering chapter. Conversations that had trailed off years earlier resumed briefly, but without sensationalism. Residents reflected on the quiet resilience of Amy's family and the determination of investigators who had refused to let the file disappear into archives. The story was told not as a spectacle, but as proof that persistence could bridge even the longest silence. The arrest and trial marked the end of uncertainty. Questions that had persisted for 19 years were answered with clarity. While nothing could reverse the loss, the acknowledgement of truth carried meaning. The community recognized it, gathering one final time in the town square to honor Amy's memory, now anchored not in mystery, but in fact. Closure arrived not in celebration, but in reflection. After the trial, Amy's parents addressed the community. Their words were simple: gratitude for answers, acknowledgement of grief, and a reminder of their daughter's kindness. They stressed that justice did not erase loss, but it allowed memory to settle without the weight of uncertainty. The message resonated across the town. Detectives who had worked the case, past and present, gathered privately at the precinct. They reviewed the preserved files, the notes written in steady hands across 2 decades. Many remarked that the discipline of record-keeping had been the silent partner in solving the case. Each log, each interview, had created a trail that science eventually illuminated. The lesson was plain: persistence mattered, even when progress seemed impossible. In the wider community, Amy's story became a point of teaching. Local schools invited detectives to speak about the importance of documentation and patience. Students learned how small details, like a time card or a car description, could one day carry immense weight. The narrative was shared not as fear, but as an example of resilience. The tone remained measured, focused on the quiet determination that brought truth forward. Her family continued to honor her in private ways. They established a small scholarship in her name, supporting students pursuing forensic science. The gesture reflected both gratitude and the belief that new generations could prevent other families from enduring similar silence. At the annual remembrance service, they read her favorite passages and lit candles, the circle of friends still gathering after all these years. Reporters eventually moved on, but the file remained in archives, marked, closed with conviction. For investigators, the case became a reference point for future cold case work. It demonstrated how advances in science could revive even the quietest mysteries, provided the foundation had been carefully preserved. The story circulated among departments, a quiet motivation to maintain diligence. For the town, life resumed its ordinary rhythm. Streets filled with familiar routines, businesses opened and closed, and new families made homes where old stories lingered. Yet the memory of Amy Kesler persisted, not as a shadow, but as a reminder of resilience. Residents carried the knowledge that truth could emerge, even from decades of silence. The case ended with answers, but also with continuity. Detectives reminded the community that many other files remained open, each awaiting its own revival. They emphasized that Amy's resolution did not close the book on cold cases, but offered hope for those still waiting. The ethical note was clear. Justice is not swift for all, but persistence holds value. And so the story rested. Amy's absence had shaped nearly 20 years of community memory. Her presence, preserved in photographs and in the words of those who loved her, remained. The trial had returned clarity, allowing her story to be told with finality. Yet the lesson extended beyond one town. Across the state, families still waiting listened carefully. They heard that patience, science, and steady work could bridge the gap between disappearance and truth. In closing, Amy's case stood as proof that silence is not the same as forgetting. The community had not forgotten, and in time, silence gave way to answers. From that moment forward, her story joined the broader narrative of resilience, ensuring that her memory carried forward with calm dignity, guiding the path toward truth in cases still unresolved.